fundamental starting place of the 3D sound field. And I want to go over one other thing here, which is the mix mapping worksheet. Okay, and this will kind of help maybe to solidify some of the understanding of what it is that I'm talking about here and what we're working on. The mix mapping worksheet is a sheet that is was designed by me as a way of getting you to help do some ear training so that you can kind of teach your ears about how to listen, right, to sound. So what we're really doing here with this sheet is we're going to be listing instrumentation, right? So in other words, I may list and start out like with kick and snare, and I hear a hi-hat, and I hear some cymbals or overheads, let's just say, okay? And so what I would do is I will just say cymbals, right? And I'll just keep it that way on an individual thing. And then let's just say we have bass, right? Have an acoustic guitar, an electric guitar, piano, and let's just say, let's keep it simple and we'll call it a vocal. So when we listen to the mix, the first thing we're going to listen to is the levels of the instrument. So maybe the vocal is the loudest, right? The snare drum is the second loudest. The kick drum is not far behind. Maybe that's an 8.5. The hi-hat is maybe like a 6, right? The cymbals are not very loud. They're like 5. It's kind of light, right? The bass is kind of sitting there somewhere around a 7. Acoustic guitar is a 7.5. Electric guitar maybe is a little more prominent, 8.5. And the piano is sort of set back a little bit. Maybe it's a 5. Right, so there's no right answer here, but the idea is that you fill numbers relatively to kind of give the balance. Like the lowest thing in the mix, right, maybe some other instrument you barely hear and it's a 1, right? It's something that's way off in the distance. And then we will list the panning, right? So for the kick drum, we may say, okay, the panning is right here, snare drum is in the center, hi-hat is off to the left, so it's drummer's perspective, right? Maybe we hear different cymbals, right? 2 crashes and a ride cymbal, or maybe there's another crash over here. The bass is probably center. The acoustic guitar panned here. The electric guitar panned here, right, or here rather. The piano, right, spread wide, left and right. Okay, so I said a thing here. The vocal in the center, and what this does is it gives you kind of a basic idea of how instruments are planned out, right? I'm going to skip over compression and go to equalization. With the equalization curve, imagine that this is like 20 kilohertz, or 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. So rather than just saying, yeah, it has EQ, or, you can't really say, oh, -6 at 2K, because you don't know what the original sounded like. But what you can do here is you could draw the shape of it, right? So maybe there's like a boost here, a dip in the mid-range, a peak there in the mid-range, and then it kind of drops off quickly. And the snare drum has less low end, right? But it's kind of got a fundamental tone here, a sharp attack at a particular frequency, and is steadier across the frequency spectrum. The hi-hat has got most of its low end rolled off, right? And it's very sharp and present, right? And you can kind of go through the individual instrumentation, right? And kind of draw just the way that you kind of hear it across the frequency spectrum, where it fits in. And these kind of map out sort of puzzle pieces, right, to how something works, right? The electric guitar has a certain shape, right? The piano covers maybe a wider range of frequencies, the vocal a different range. And you kind of work with all of these. And then you figure out, well, how compressed, right? So you could talk about compression. Now, initially, this is going to be, you could put something like very compressed, right? It sounds very compressed. Later on, you'll be able to take the snare and you could say, like, this is a P&B, not a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's that would be P&J. PB&J? Yeah, I guess. Pump and breathe, right? Maybe that's on the overheads, right? There's a pump and breathe kind of thing on the overheads, right? But you could describe, like maybe with the snare drum, it sounds more distant, so you could put this like a fast attack, right? There's a fast attack on it. You could start to put down some basic settings for what it's doing, right? It's a limiter, right? It's a limiter, or it's a compressor, right? Is it squashing the transients, or is it allowing them to pop through, okay? And start to get an ear for that. And then you could put any effects that you hear, right? So maybe you start off and you say there's a reverb on the snare. Eventually you may say it's a plate or it's a hall reverb, right? The kick drum is dry, right? The hi-hat or the overheads have some kind of room sound. That's probably from the acoustic recording, right? The bass sounds like a direct, right? It's a DI, or maybe it has a chorus effect on it, right? And the chorus effect spreads the sound wide, okay? Etc. So you kind of go through the different sounds, right? And you figure out what, the different things. Maybe there's a hall reverb on the piano, right? Or a chamber program on the vocal sound. And eventually you'll start to hear these different things, right, that make up the mix mapping. So what you do is you start with a song that you really love, right, in terms of the way it mixes, and start to write these things down. You could take a whole CD, right, and like I said, there's no right answer here and perfect answer. And also there are going to be things where the acoustic guitar is going to be louder in one section, maybe in the choruses, than it is in the verses. Fine, okay? You can't do everything there, but there's no perfect answer, right? There's no right or wrong, but in terms of exactitude. But what you want to do is get used to listening, because what you're doing is you're building what's called templates, mixing templates in your head as you start to analyze music this way. So this is where you start, right, is with the mix mapping worksheet. The next level is to go from the front perspective. And then what you're going to do is you could get a little bit more creative, because now what you can do is you can say, well, from the front perspective, you could even pick different colors, right? Print this out. And this, by the way, is actually on the website, right? So if you actually go to the mixing workshop, and I think it's a visual approach to audio, right? I think that's right here. There is the mix mapping PDF, right? So you could download the mix mapping. I also included it as an Excel spreadsheet in case you wanted to edit it, but you can just click on those links there, right, and get to that. So that's in the lesson 2 of class 1, right, a visual approach to audio. And so here in the second part of the exercise, what you're doing is you're now drawing where the sound comes from. So if you hear the vocal, you want to say the vocal sounds like it's way up in the speaker here. Maybe the kick drum sounds mostly low down at the bottom, but there's a little, the kick or the attack, right, is sort of attached to it, sounds up higher in the speakers. It's naturally going to do that, right? And then as you get into, the bass, right, the bass is going to have like another certain area. And you could use, a program like this, Sketchbook or something like that, if you wanted to do it this way, and just load it up and hop onto it that way. Or you could just, print it out and get some crayons out and draw some things. So maybe you hear an acoustic guitar, and the acoustic guitar kind of sits right over here, right? And then you hear an electric guitar, and the electric guitar kind of sits a little bit lower in the speaker. Okay, and then you hear, for example, the snare drum, and the snare drum sounds really dense, and you could actually make the drawing more dense, where the snare drum kind of hits or feels, right? And the hi-hat, right, is off here, right? Or maybe it's up higher, and you hear the cymbals, right, up at a certain height, right? And you get this sense. Now, just because that's the way it looks doesn't mean that's the way you hear it in the mix, okay? So draw it where you hear it. And then when you've done the front side view, you could then go back and start to do the top side view, right? So when you do the top side view, it's the same thing, because now that kick drum, for example, if we look at that kick drum may sound right here, or it may sound up closer to you, or it may sound more distant. And that snare drum may sound over here, right? And the vocal may sound way up front, right? For example, that acoustic guitar, it's supposed to be blue, is over here, and the electric guitar sounds, here, right? And you could start to balance out where the individual elements are, where they sit. Maybe that hi-hat, right, really sticks out up front, right? And so you can get into all of these different, things, right? Maybe there's something else, like that piano sounds like way off in the distance. Okay, and what this does is it gives you a sense of how things, right? All right, so hold on, I got a question here. Right, so would it be possible to elaborate on things getting stuck in the speakers because they are out of balance? Yeah. See, this is basically the whole course is going to be about how you unstick things. The way that you create separation from different things, the first place that you start is with levels and panning, because the levels create front, back, and left, right movement. Then you do subtractive EQ, because what you do from there is you filter away the frequencies from instruments that don't need them. You want something to sound more distant in the speaker, then you filter off a little more of the low end, a little more of the high end. You want it to sound up front, you leave more full frequency, right? And so you kind of, it's not like big major things, it's lots of little things that build up, right? And then when you get past that, you start to get into compression, and then you apply the compression to help enhance the effect of the subtractive EQ. The real key with the subtractive EQ, which is one of the most powerful things, is it takes away frequency areas where instruments get glued together, right? So anytime an instrument, two instruments or multiple instruments occupy too many similar frequencies, then what ends up happening is they start to glue together, they stick together, right? And that's a huge problem, right? So by filtering away the ones that don't need those frequencies, you create some separation and allows the instruments to be heard in their own unique way. And so it's a balance of a lot of things. Then applying equalization, additive equalization, effects processing, early reflections and reverb, modulation effects, which can spread the sound outside of the speakers, using phase effects, right? That can spread things out. All other kinds of like tremolo, vibrato, chorusing, right? Flanging, phasing. All those things have different effects in the speaker. And then what you do is you try to process each of these sounds in their own unique way. The tricky part is creating the balance, because it's all about contrast. We perceive things in contrast. We don't perceive things that stay the same. We're always perceiving movement. You're sitting in a room, right? The cat walks across the room. That's your point of attention, right? Because that's the one object that's moving in the room. Now, if the table is moving on its own, then you're probably freaked out in addition to watching the table, because you're trying to figure out, is that table going to come over here and hit me over the head, right? So there's that side of it. But things that are moving, that are dynamic, that stand out from other things are the things that you notice the most. You walk into a room and there's one big bright yellow painting in a room that has dark walls. It's like that's the first thing you're going to see. You make a mix the same way, right? You frame something. Most of the time that's the vocal that you frame. You frame the vocal sound, right? And therefore, what happens is that you notice that difference. So if you want the vocal to sound really warm and rich, then everything else around it has to be less warm and less rich in order for the vocal to be perceived that way, right? That's the whole idea. You want something to be present, everything around it has to be less present in order for the presence of that one thing to come out. And when you work that way, what happens is you won't be adding 14 dB at 2K to get that to happen, right? Because if everything in your mix has, 6 dB at 2 kilohertz, then in order to make something stand out from that, you're going to have to put 12 dB at 2 kilohertz to make that one instrument sound brighter at that frequency area than the others. The other approach is to say, well, let me just not add that in. Maybe I filter away the other frequencies that make that 2K not stand out as much, right? And then when I put it in, I only have to put in a touch on the one thing that I want to stand out. It's all a relative game. It's all a relative balance of different things together. And this is like, I can kind of go on, and I sort of have to move on here, but that's the whole basic thing, right? So, and that's the mix mapping worksheet. If you start working with that, that will completely change, right, the way that you're mixing, because you will start to create templates, right? It's sort of like making a map, right? You're going to go on a road trip, right? You may go to your Google map and try to figure out which way you're going to go. So in your head, you got your navigation control, of course, but if something goes wrong with your navigation control and you didn't do any research beforehand, then you're lost. You're like, oh man, my navigation's all messed up, or I lost my navigation. I don't have navigation. I have no idea where I am, right? But if you actually go and you print out a map or you study the best route and you look at different options and maybe you think, hey, we're going on this long trip, maybe we'll divert over this way because, we'll be able to get something to eat in this town, right? As opposed to some, crappy little dive town. We want to eat a little bit better, whatever. And you kind of map out the way that you want to go, right? And it's the same with mixing, right? So the more that you study the route, right, which you take, right, that you want to take, the approach that you want to take, the better chance you're going to have at it. So this gets on to a little bit later. We're going to talk about how you template a song, right? So usually what you try to do is you want to get a song, and this is something you do really early on, especially, it's very powerful, is you get a song that is very similar to the one that you're mixing. And then you use that as a gauge or a guide. So when you listen to that, you're not trying to match it perfectly for frequencies, but when you do it and you listen and you do a mix mapping of that song because it's really great and amazing and you love the way they produced it and mixed it and put it together and all that sort of stuff, when you approach yours, you will be thinking along the same lines. I love the way they put the drums set way back on the speakers, and then you will go about the process of doing the things to make that happen. And I love the way they got the vocals so dry with that slap back, right? That gives it that real wide sense of distance. And you go about the process of doing those things that make that happen, right? And creating the contrast. So that's really a powerful lesson, right? You're studying it. Sort of think of it as like transcribing, right? If you study a musical instrument, you study piano, and maybe you're into Chick Corea, right? So you start trying to transcribe his solos or something, or the way that he plays. You try to emulate him, try to play like him. You listen to his records over and over again, and you try and get your chops up to that same level. And you really, and so if you keep doing that, you get closer and closer and closer every time that you do it, right? And it's the same kind of idea, right? You have to compare against the work of professionals. Work that you really admire, that you listen to and say, I just love the way it sounds. I wish I could mix like that. Well, yeah, study it, right? Transcribe it. That's what the mix mapping worksheet is all about, right? And that's how it works. That's how it works.